Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. Our main event within our multi-day severe weather setup has arrived. We have a moderate risk out from the SPC, a level 4 out of 5 from the Memphis, Tennessee area down through the ArkLaMiss region. So southeast Arkansas, northeast Louisiana, into northwest and western Mississippi. All hazards on the table for today. Focusing in on the tornado threat, there is a 15% hatched area. So a very relatively higher threat for tornadoes there within that 15 hash corridor. Places like Memphis, Greenville, places like Delhi, Louisiana, Hernando, South Haven, Mississippi, Pine Bluff, Arkansas, under the gun for a significant tornado threat, some of which could be strong and long track today. That also is the case in the 10 hatched area that extends up to the Tennessee-Kentucky border, places like Little Rock, Shreveport, and over into northeast Mississippi. Damaging wind going to be a threat as well, 30 hatched there, including places like Jackson, Memphis, Greenville for significant damaging winds. There is a large hail threat today, although I don't think that is going to be the main threat. They do have a significant hail area extending from the Texas-Louisiana border near Shreveport up to the Memphis, Tennessee area. But I think the main threats today are going to be strong tornadoes and damaging winds. Very intricate setup, so let's go ahead and dive in. Let's take a look at our water vapor satellite imagery as we always do. And you see this broad fetch of southwesterly flow here across the southern portion of the country. That is on the leading edge of this trough. You see this band of yellow. Those are band of yellow colors. That's slightly drier air that's worked its way in, and that kind of defines the edge of that trough. So we have a very strong trough making its way into the southeast today. If we look at our weather map here, our 500 millibar map, you see exactly where that trough is located, right across the desert southwest. It has some embedded shortwaves in it as well, little kinks in the flow, but a very broad, fairly low amplitude trough, not one of those very deep digging troughs that we often see this time of year, but a very potent trough making its way in. And this is going to take on a negative tilt as it moves into the southern plains into the southeast this afternoon and evening, making a very favorable synoptic background pattern for severe weather. Let's take a look at what's going on right now on the radar. We have multiple complexes of storms. We have a band of storms from western Arkansas into southeast Oklahoma, north Texas, somewhat along or just behind the cold front. You can kind of see the cold front here, this band of reflectivity that's surging forward there across central Texas. That is the actual cold front. It hasn't made a ton of progress since yesterday. Yesterday it was somewhat in this vicinity here across west central Texas up into Oklahoma. Hasn't made a ton of progress. That's because this trough, this 500 millibar trough, is lagging a little bit behind. You'll see the axis of this trough is still over the New Mexico-Arizona border region, with the exit region somewhat over here, now just impinging into western and central Texas. So it's hanging back a little bit. We haven't, as a result, had very strong low-level mass response. So a surface low development, low-level jet development has been very weak across this vicinity here. So we haven't had this cold front make strong eastward progress. But it will do so today as surface cyclogenesis takes place very rapidly as we go into the next several hours here from north central Texas, then eventually moving into Arkansas and into the Mississippi River Delta region near western Tennessee. So interesting setup here. Usually we'd see some sort of strong low-level cyclone, and just if you hear some background noise, I apologize. I'm coming to you live from Shreveport this morning, Shreveport, Louisiana, in preparation for chasing this event. So this is not my normal setup. So if you hear some background noise, I apologize. But back to the weather here. That cold front is moving somewhat to the east a little bit, and again, that's going to move off to the east, continue to move off to the east today. We also have a band of storms here from Kentucky into western Tennessee and eastern Arkansas. This band of storms is interesting. This is well ahead of the cold front. And again, all of these storms are elevated. Maybe some sporadic severe reports today. We do have a severe thunderstorm watch across north central Texas right now. I don't think this severe threat is going to be overall that robust this morning. So maybe a few sporadic damaging wind and maybe some hail reports, but the main threat is going to come later this afternoon. But this band of storms is interesting. You can see it's moving off to the southeast a little bit. If we zoom in here on the Memphis radar, you'll see that it is moving and it's propagating as if it's along some sort of outflow boundary. Just from experience, I can tell that these storms are they're not really moving, they're propagating. We're getting new development on the leading edge of this line, especially down here with southwestern extent. That tells me that these may be riding along some sort of outflow, that may be starting to push out outflow ahead of these storms. That may be an interesting feature later on. We may have to watch for any outflow boundary development up here across northwestern Mississippi into eastern Arkansas for later on. That could be a player. As we know, outflow boundaries tend to enhance the low-level shear along them and can enhance the overall tornado threat with storms that track along the outflow boundary. So we'll have to monitor this complex here over the next several hours. I do think a weakening trend will ensue with all of this convection. Even the stuff back here in Oklahoma and Arkansas will undergo a weakening trend. These are already fairly weak as is, but we'll have to watch these for sure over the next few hours to see if they do put out any outflow boundaries. Here's our visible satellite imagery, and this is pretty interesting as well. We see quite a bit of sunshine across this region. That is not typical for these southeast events. Usually we see the region socked in cloud cover. We're hoping for a few cloud breaks. That's not the case right now. We're seeing quite a bit of sunshine here. You can see that very strong onshore flow, very strong southerly flow across the region. Very strong warm advection is underway. We'll take a look at some soundings here in a second to show you those photographs showing those veering winds in the lowest levels. Very strong, warm, moist advection ongoing with these storms. With this air mass moving in from the Gulf. So moisture not really going to be an issue, especially low-level moisture not going to be an issue today. You can also see those high-level clouds up here moving off to the northeast. This is our complex of storms back in here from Oklahoma into Arkansas and North Texas. That shows you the wind shear in the atmosphere. Winds aloft out of the southwest, winds at the surface out of the south or south-southeast. So very strong wind shear profiles in the atmosphere today. Let's take a look again at our weather map. So here's again our 500 millibar map, very strong trough. That's going to take on a much more negative tilt, especially this portion here, this little shortwave. You see this little enhancement of the kinkiness, as I always say, in that portion of the wave. That's going to move off to the northeast and take on a little bit more of a negative tilt as we go into the afternoon and evening hours today. Very, very classic synoptic setup with this upper trough for severe weather. Let's go down to the surface, show you that we haven't had robust surface low development yet. Because that trough is hanging back a little bit, still back in this region here, we haven't seen strong low-level cyclogenesis yet. We're starting to see it here along the cold frontal zone here in north central Texas. Your cold front is in there. We do see some semblance of surface low development in here. We'll take a look at the actual surface data in a sec. But mostly just a broad cyclone here. But that's going to change as we go into the next few hours. That exit region, that southwesterly flow going to traverse into the region. We will see very strong cyclogenesis along that cold front. That will start to push off to the northeast fairly rapidly as we go into the late afternoon hours this evening. So we haven't seen a strong low-level or surface response yet. That means we shouldn't have a very strong low-level response, especially with our low-level jet. Now, we do have a fairly strong low-level jet in place. There is this broad troughiness here across the central into the southern plains here at 850 millibars that has induced a fairly strong low-level jet, still displaced from the overall target region, or at least the main axis of this jet. Very strong winds there across southeast Texas, 55, 60 knots of southwesterly flow there. That should begin to overspread the region. We should have a very strong low-level jet in place through much of the day. That should increase as we go into the late afternoon and evening hours as that surface low develops, as that low-level cyclone develops and moves off to the east-northeast. We should see that mass response really take shape, and most models and meteorologically, from our meteorological assessment of things, we should see a very significant strengthening of the low-level jet across that ArkLaMiss region late this afternoon into evening. That will enhance low-level photographs, and that is a main driver for the significant tornado threat that we're seeing today. We'll take a look at some model data here in just a second. Here's our surface data. Let me refresh here just to show you the latest data. So we'll point out a couple of features here for you. Here is our cold front situated somewhere in this vicinity right here. You can see the wind shift. Winds on the west side or northwest side of that boundary are have a much stronger northerly component, northeasterly here across Kansas and Oklahoma into Missouri, a little bit more due northerly here across North Texas, with southerly or south-southeasterly winds across the warm sector to the southeast of the boundary. So our cold front is there, and you can see in the wind barbs here across north central Texas that we have developed some semblance of a stronger surface low in this vicinity. Those winds somewhat spiraling around that center. And so we are seeing a little bit of enhanced surface low development right along that cold front. That is going to be our main surface low. That will continue to consolidate as that trough, that exit region of the trough moves in. We will see that low strengthen and deepen, and it will quickly move off to the northeast, and that will be a favored corridor for significant severe weather later on this afternoon and evening. Now, for moisture's sake, let's take a look here, and you can see all these 60s dew points extending really off the map with eastward extent here into the Florida Panhandle, into Alabama, and assumedly into Georgia. Very widespread 60s dew points all the way up here to the Ohio, almost to the Ohio River Valley at this point. But a very, very broad warm sector here. I'm trying to define our 60s dew point line. It's probably going to be modulated by our cold front out here, but you get the idea. Very, very broad warm sector in place at this point with the highest dew points situated here across Mississippi, back into Arkansas, Louisiana, and East Texas. That's going to be our main corridor. And so low-level moisture not going to be an issue today. We're going to continue to see that strong low-level warm moist advection as that low deepens and moves off to the east-northeast. That will maintain that broad warm sector, allowing for a lot of real estate for multiple rounds of severe storms, including along the perhaps along the cold front near that surface low, as well as out in the open warm sector. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So a very primed surface environment here for significant severe weather that we're seeing already this morning. Let's take a look at some sounding data. I want to go back to last night. This is the Dallas-Fort Worth sounding at 0Z last night. So this is going to be Thursday evening at 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. And this is about as textbook as it gets for a severe weather sounding. This is an absolute loaded gun. I put out a tweet on the Convective Chronicles Twitter yesterday evening when I took a look at this. Just absolute sounding at which we can marvel here. Very, very deep moist layer. This moist layer extends almost all the way up to 700 millibars here. So extremely deep low-level moisture, at least as of last night, beneath a stout elevated mixed layer. Some drier air aloft, helping to cap that air mass, and that is what was expected to advect into the target area, the moderate risk area for today. So a very significantly favorable thermodynamic profile for severe weather. And our hodograph as well was very favorable. Very strong low-level shear, strong streamwise vorticity in the low levels. Again, that streamwise vorticity is our storm relative wind vector from our storm motion back to our hodograph. And then our horizontal vorticity vector is always perpendicular and to the left of the hodograph. And then when those two vectors are parallel, that's when you have strong streamwise vorticity, which is much more favorable when supercells ingest it to produce tornadoes. And you can see very favorable streamwise vorticity in this profile at Dallas last night. Strong deep layer shear for supercells as well, 0 to 6 kilometer shear approaching 50 knots with that strong low-level storm relative helicity. So all in all, a very favorable look that was advecting into the region last night from the west. And this was well within the warm sector, as you can see here, 63-degree dew point in Dallas last night. So this was well within the warm sector and looked to be a good sample of what we might see advecting into our moderate risk area today. Now let's take a look at this morning. Let's go down to Shreveport. Shreveport has definitely maintained that very deep moist layer you can see here. Some drier air aloft has maintained itself as well, and our favorable looking profiles for supercells with significant severe weather. Strong low-level veering of those winds, strong low-level shear, and strong deep layer shear for supercells. Now, let's go south to Lake Charles. This is what's interesting. We have had an interesting development here in that we've had a staunch increase in the amount of dry air that has made its way into the region. If we look at our mid-level water vapor here. So this is our mid-level water vapor. When we look for our swirlies, so to speak, I always look at the upper-level water vapor. Let's look at the mid-level water vapor here, and you can see this plume of yellows and oranges making its way in off the Gulf here in the mid-levels. That is drier air. So we've had quite a bit of drier air work its way in, especially with southern extent, across the warm sector this morning. Now, what impact that will have on storms later on is still unknown. Drier air not quite as favorable for sustaining supercells that can, you can entrain that dry air into the updrafts of maturing supercells, and that can kind of pinch them off, and make them struggle a little bit to intensify later on. You can also see that the moist layer much shallower here with southern extent. Still 71/70 at the surface, so surface moisture very favorable here at Lake Charles. But that moist layer not nearly as deep as it was both last night and this morning with areas farther north and northwest. So we'll have to watch this for sure. I do think we will see some degree of moistening as we go into the afternoon hours. That trough moves in. We should see moistening within the column as we continue to see that low-level and mid-level warm, moist advection here, but we'll have to watch that for sure, as this dry air may be a fly in the ointment for at least warm sector development, I think, later on today. Although I do think this will work itself out later on today, and we shouldn't see this much of a dry profile with height across the region. So very interesting development here. Let's go off to the east. Let's go to Little Rock a little bit. Much more moist profile. So that drier air, at least at 12Z, so 7 a.m. Central Daylight Time, about an hour and a half ago as I'm recording this, still confined to mostly those far southern areas along the coast. Northern extent, that warm sector still well intact, especially with northern and northwestern extent. Here at Little Rock, you can see a much more moist profile. Very favorable look for supercells with that hodograph as well. How about Jackson, Mississippi? Jackson, same thing. We have seen some drier air work its way in. So it looks like with southern and eastern extent within the warm sector, that drier air has really taken over. And that is where we're expecting to see that discrete prefrontal convection out there across northeast Louisiana, western Mississippi, and northwest Mississippi into southeast Arkansas. So we'll have to watch this for sure. But you could definitely consider this somewhat of a loaded gun sounding. Moist layer a little bit deeper here at Jackson, up to about 850 millibars, so beneath that layer of drier air aloft. Again, I think that will work itself out, but this was not quite as robust on some of the modeling data from the last couple of days, so that may have a little bit of an impact if we can't really get this dry air out of there. Again, I think we will be able to, at least to a significant extent, but we'll have to watch that for sure as we go into the main part of this setup. All right, let's look at some model data. This is going to be the 6Z NAM. Let me check to make sure the 12Z is not in yet. The 12Z is just rolling in, so we will take a look here at the 12Z. It's going to be rolling in, the 12Z NAM, going to be rolling in as we're doing this discussion. So we'll start off at 500 millibars, and it's initialized that trough pretty well out here across the desert southwest into western Mexico. Here's our axis of that trough, very neutrally tilted at this point, very strong jet streak rounding the base of that trough and into the exit region of that trough. Strong high pressure ridge here across Florida, so that it's going to allow this trough to somewhat ride up and over this trough, this ridge, although this ridge will get suppressed a little bit as this trough moves in. So it will take on a little bit more of an east-northeasterly track, and as it does that, it's going to take on a little bit more of a negative tilt. So I'm going to go back to the 6Z run here just real quickly. So you can see what happens here. As we go into the late afternoon and evening hours, that trough takes on a very much negative tilt, and this is an extremely classic evolution for the upper level trough in tornado outbreak scenarios. You can see it's taking on a negative tilt, and it's basically giving a glancing blow to our area of interest. Our area of interest, that moderate risk situated right in here, right in the exit region of that trough as it takes on that negative tilt. Now, I want to show an example. This is April 27th, 2011. Now, I'm not at all comparing the outcome of today's particular event to the April 27th event. The April 27th event, as we know, is the gold standard for tornado outbreak events here in the United States. I just want to show the overall background pattern here at 500 millibars to show you how similar today's pattern is to past tornado outbreak scenarios. So here's our 500 millibar pattern at 12Z on April 27th, 2011. Watch what happens to the trough. So here's our shortwave, here's our trough, centered here across the southern plains, very neutrally tilted at this point. Now watch as we go through with time, as we go into the heart of the outbreak, that shortwave, that piece there on the southeastern flank takes on a little bit of a negative tilt, and you have that jet streak impinging in the region. Our main focus for tornadic supercells was down here across Alabama and Mississippi, right on the southeastern fringes of that shortwave. Very similar setup today. And again, I'm not comparing today's event to April 27, 2011. I just want to give you an example of a similar scenario with the upper level pattern. So as we go through the day today, that trough is going to take on a much more negative tilt, and what we should be right on the fringes of that for our particular area of interest. So very textbook synoptic setup for severe weather, at least in the mid and upper levels with this particular event. So as this trough swings through, it will continue off to the northeast with that negative tilt. I'm going to go back to 6Z real quick here, and you'll see it ejects into the Great Lakes vicinity into the northeast, and we're left with just broad southwesterly flow behind it. Let's go down to the surface. I want to show you the surface pattern as we go into this evening. Let me zoom in to our southern sector. So again, this is our 6Z NAM. This is now at 12Z. You can see that elongated surface low here across north central into central Texas. Not much of a surface response yet, but watch what happens here as we go into the afternoon hours. That surface low consolidates along that cold frontal zone, which is right in there. Very strong surface low now across that ArkLaTex vicinity, so to speak, right in there. And that is, as we know, going to do a couple of things. Number one, it's going to allow those winds in the warm sector to continue to strengthen and back out of the south or southeast. That's going to continue to pull that surface moisture northward, although we really don't need it. We have a very broad warm sector already in place. That will continue that low-level warm moist advection through much of the afternoon as that surface low strengthens. And as we know, we should have an attendant low-level mass response in the low-level jet. We'll take a look at that in a second. But here's at 21Z, so 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Very potent surface low there up into Arkansas. This should be, again, a favored corridor here along what is now effectively a warm front extending back to the surface low, with our cold front still draped back here into Texas. So that cold front going to be very slow to progress to the east with southern extent, not so much along that surface low, which will be surging to the east pretty quickly. We should have, again, a favored corridor for severe weather right along this vicinity there, here across Arkansas into Tennessee. Farther to the south, broad warm sector once again in place, and so we should have plenty of real estate for some prefrontal storms here across the region. Now, let's look at the dew points real quick. And you can see just a very broad looking warm sector there. We don't often get this with these events. Usually the warm sector will get pinched off as you go into the afternoon as that surface level surges east. It's not going to be the case with this event. You can see a broad warm sector hangs on through much of the day, even well into the overnight hours, until that surface low really surges east, and then we get that northern extent to get pinched off there with time. But for much of the day, we will see a very broad warm sector extending from East Texas all the way into Mississippi and even into Alabama, western Alabama, although the main threat should be right here along the Mississippi River, well within the warm sector. Now let's go back to 850 millibars, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit once again. So low-level jet, once again, going to be very strong through much of the day across this region, as we will get very slow and eventually rapid low-level cyclogenesis here across the region. So we do have a strong low-level jet in place, 40 to 50 plus knots here across Arkansas, Louisiana, into East Texas. But watch what happens here between 21Z, 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time, and 0Z. We see a large ramp up, and even 3Z. We see a very significant ramp up in the low-level jet right across that Mississippi River region into western Tennessee, Mississippi, even into Alabama and areas farther north along the surface low. We go from basically, 30 to 40, even 50 knots, up to some 60 to 70 plus knots here along that surface low track up into western Tennessee. So we should see very rapid surface cyclone or low-level cyclone strengthening here as we go into the evening hours, and that will in turn strengthen that low-level jet significantly, and as we know, that does a number on low-level shear. That will really enlarge those photographs as we go into the evening hours, and that is when the significant tornado threat may maximize across the moderate risk area and even areas farther to the north that may be a little bit removed from the best instability, but still have adequate instability for severe storms. We may see a significant tornado threat up there as well along that surface low track. But you can also see that low-level jet extends well back into the Mississippi River Delta, even into Mississippi, northwest Alabama. So any prefrontal storms that are ongoing ahead of this round of storms near and just to the south of the surface low will have a significant tornado threat as well. All right, let's look at before we look at some soundings, I also want to look for any prefrontal confluence bands. Last night's NAM was showing a pretty striking evidence for prefrontal confluence. Let's see if that's the case here with this morning run, and I'm going to go back to the 12Z run since that's our newest data that's in. So this is going to be at 21Z, And bingo, right in there across this region, I spy a prefrontal trough. So that could be an interesting development. We will have storms fire here probably by mid-afternoon or so, near and just to the south of the surface low here. That will be more so organized into a QLCS, given the strong forcing near that surface low track. But this prefrontal trough has my attention. This could be an impetus for prefrontal warm sector discrete supercell development. And as we know, in this kind of environment, we haven't even looked at the forecast soundings yet, but the environment is very favorable for significant severe weather, and if you can maximize that, then you'll be able to maximize that threat with any discrete storms. And I am seeing some evidence of a prefrontal trough here across southern Arkansas into northeast Louisiana and southwest and west Mississippi. And that's, again, at 21Z, 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. So very interesting setup. I also like to look at 850 millibars if we can see any confluence bands up in their little kinks in the flow at 850 millibars here in these streamlines. This is 21Z, and that little confluence band or little prefrontal trough is showing itself there across southern Arkansas into northern and northeastern Louisiana. You can see a little kink in the flow, just barely there, and very subtle there into that region. So I am seeing some pretty decent evidence, at least on the NAM, that we may have a prefrontal confluence or prefrontal trough to work with to develop some prefrontal warm sector discrete supercells. Very interesting. If that can happen, as we know, discrete supercells will be able to maximize the significant tornado threat in this particular environment. All right, let's look at some soundings. So once again, we should see a pretty quick transition to a linearly organized complex along that surface low track. So central Arkansas back into the ArkLaTex region should be our first area for severe weather development later this afternoon, perhaps into north central Louisiana as well. We should see right ahead of that surface low. That will be our favored area for initial storm development. Then we will also have to watch for prefrontal discrete development there across the Mississippi River Delta vicinity of southeast Arkansas, western Mississippi, into northeast Louisiana, just ahead of that QLCS. So we'll start at 21Z, and I will take a sounding out in here just ahead of the surface low track. So let me put the surface low on. So let's go up in here. So east central Arkansas, right ahead of that surface low track. Then we will take one down here, right northeastern Louisiana. So here is our sounding. This is at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. And the instability farther north is not going to be as favorable. You can see a little bit of wonkiness in the thermodynamic profile there. This could be a NAM issue. As we said, we see a lot of sunshine already. Temperatures are already into the 70s down here to the south. I expect that to be the case later on today, although we may be a little bit cooler with northern extent being a little bit removed from that very strongest warm advection at the surface. But still, adequate instability for a severe threat. But look at that hodograph. That hodograph is extremely impressive. Very strong curvature in that low-level hodograph. Very strong low-level shear amid strong deep layer shear for supercells. And again, the mode with northern extent, at least the initial mode, should be more of a QLCS. But when this kind of shear profile, would expect to see several embedded tornadoes, perhaps some strong, given very strong low-level shear. Effective storm relative helicity over 400 meters squared per second squared up there along the surface low track. Very potent looking profile. Now down to the south, instability should be a little bit stronger. Not really seeing that on the NAM here. I do think we did see a little bit of an increase in overall mixed layer CAPE here between those two soundings, about 1,500 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE. 81 over 68 at the surface. You can see that drier air has worked itself out a little bit. I think that might be why the NAM is holding back a little bit on the low-level instability here. And I don't think that's going to matter too much, especially as we go into the early evening hours towards 0Z. But you do see a little bit of a remnant of that drier air, which may be just slightly limiting instability overall, especially in the low to mid levels. But still, favorable looking mixed layer CAPE for supercells, or for a severe threat, and that hodograph definitely favorable for supercells as well. Strong low-level shear, not quite as strong as farther north along the surface low track, but still deep layer shear favorable for supercells. And so any prefrontal discrete supercells would be in this environment would have a strong tornado, perhaps a large hail threat, at least initially, especially if they can get going a little bit before 21Z. This is at 18Z. I would imagine the low-level shear is a little bit weaker at this point, so there may be an initial large hail threat, although, again, I don't think the large hail threat will be that strong. You see a lot weaker low-level shear before that increase later on in the afternoon. I think the tornado threat and damaging wind threat will take over at that point. So let's move forward a little bit. Let's go to 0Z. So we should have an ongoing QLCS at this point from maybe western Tennessee, far northeast Arkansas, down into southeast Arkansas, north central Louisiana. By 0Z, this is 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. So let's take some soundings here right along the surface flow track. And then we'll take one down here in that area just to the east and southeast of the ongoing QLCS, where we could see some prefrontal development. This is our hodograph and skew-T farther north. Again, instability farther north not going to be quite as favorable, but with these kind of shear profiles, you don't need a lot of instability. That is a pretty impressive low-level shear profile, over 500 meters squared per second squared of storm relative helicity, with large looping hodographs there in the low levels. Very favorable for supercells. This is farther to the south. Instability you can see much, much more robust with southern extent. That drier air, maybe just a little bit of a kink there, still left just above 700 millibars, but I don't think that's going to have too much of an issue given strong forcing and strong shear in place. Low-level instability has increased about 80 joules per kilogram of 0 to 3 kilometer cape, 76 over 68 here at the surface. That moist layer has deepened once again very significantly up to about 700 millibars, with a very favorable looking profile for instability profile for severe convective development. On the other hand, look at our hodograph. Very strong shear as well, very strong curvature in that low-level hodograph. Deep layer shear favorable for supercells. This would be a very favorable look for significant tornadoes in any prefrontal supercells that can mature and sustain in this environment. So, very favorable, very potent look to this overall event. And as we go into the overnight hours, that QLCS will surge pretty quickly east and southeast there. And we'll, again, have to watch that environment here just ahead of that QLCS for prefrontal storms going into the evening hours. I want to take a sounding maybe just here at 6Z within that low-level jet, that extremely strong low-level jet up in here, just to show you how much the wind profiles increase in that core of the low-level jet. Given that's pretty incredible looking hodograph there, right in the core of that low-level jet. And so when you have a low-level jet like that, continuing to provide low-level warm moist convection, and the instability may actually increase as we go into the early evening hours, which is unusual, of course, as the surface tends to cool. Not going to be the case with this particular event because we're going to see continued very strong low-level warm moist convection. And these kind of hodographs, that is a favorable combination for some significant severe weather. Significant damaging winds transported to the surface in that more linearly organized complex near the surface low, as well as a significant tornado threat given such strong low-level shear. All right, let's look at some model data. Let's look at some cams just for some giggles here. The other cams are not quite in yet, so we're going to look at the 12Z HER here. So it has all that convection that has been ongoing across the Ohio River Valley down into Arkansas and Oklahoma, fairly well initialized. So let's go forward, and you can see we get a general weakening trend with this activity as we go into the morning hours. And the HER did not really have this activity that we saw down into western Tennessee and Arkansas. Again, we're going to have to watch this stuff here for any potential outflow boundaries it might spit out as those storms weaken for a favored corridor for some enhanced tornado potential. But nonetheless, the HER has a lot of convection here. It weakens through the day and eventually back into East Texas, far western Arkansas, northwest Louisiana. We should get a fairly quick transition to a QLCS initially near and just to the south of that surface low track. And as we go into the evening hours, we will have to watch out ahead for prefrontal supercell development. You can see the HER does have quite a bit of prefrontal beans or supercells there with some helicity tracks there along the Mississippi River Delta just ahead of that QLCS. Last night's runs were much more potent, much more robust with the prefrontal development. Let me show you the 0Z run from last night, just to show you how the cams are not super reliable more than a few hours out from a particular event. So I'll show you as this comes in how much more robust the HRRR was with the prefrontal development yesterday evening. And so here we go. As we go into the morning hours today, QLCS develops by afternoon, but watch how much development occurs out ahead in the open warm sector. That is quite a bit. There you can see lots of beans out in the open warm sector here, extending all the way down into northeast Louisiana. So the HRRR has backed off just a little bit with the overall degree of discrete development out in the open warm sector. But given strong low-level warm-moist advection, given that evidence of a prefrontal confluence band or prefrontal trough, I think a situation where we see several prefrontal supercells is still on the table for today. Let me look real quick at the low-level profiles here from the HRRR, see if it has any prefrontal troughs or confluence bands. And again, the internet's a little slow here, not my usual setup back at home, but this will do. So this is at 19Z. Not really seeing much in the way of prefrontal confluence or prefrontal troughs here. But as we saw in the NAM, it had a very stout-looking prefrontal confluence band or prefrontal trough in play. So we'll have to watch that for sure. We'll have to watch the data more so than these models, but I just wanted to kind of get a look and see if any of the models had a prefrontal trough. Looks like something in here. This could be this could be a little bit of a trough in here as well. This would be just ahead of the QLCS at 23Z. This is at 6 p.m. A little bit of a trough there may be a favored location for prefrontal discrete supercell development. So we're seeing multiple models with the potential for prefrontal development here. Something we'll have to really watch as we go, as again, that will maximize the overall significant severe threat with any storms that develop in that prefrontal regime. So we'll have to watch 3 overnight hours for that prefrontal development. That QLCS will continue to rage eastward with some lots of embedded tornadoes. You can see some embedded helicity tracks there near that surface low track. So that will be the favored corridor for strong tornadoes within that QLCS. Damaging winds also going to be a threat as it moves off to the east pretty quickly into Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, into Alabama overnight. All right, so that's going to do it for this morning update. Again, a moderate risk, level 4 out of 5, is in place across the ArkLaMiss vicinity, Memphis, Tennessee, down through the Mississippi River, southeast Arkansas, northwest and western Mississippi, into northeast Louisiana. Enhanced risk surrounds that as well. And those are the areas where the tornado threat is going to be the highest, especially within that 15-hash corridor from Memphis down to Greenville, Delhi, Louisiana, South Haven, Hernando, Batesville, under the gun for a significant tornado threat as well. Places like Little Rock, Shreveport should be on alert as well as you are within that 10-hatched region for significant tornadoes. Damaging winds going to be a threat, especially with northern extent where that QLCS is going to be most prevalent. So western Tennessee, northwest Mississippi, eastern Arkansas. Large hail, again, not going to be the biggest threat today. Maybe some instances of larger hail initially, especially with any prefrontal supercells. But I think damaging winds and tornadoes going to be the main threat today. So initially, storms going to fire near and just to the south of that surface low track, probably from central Arkansas down into north central or northwest Louisiana, down through east Texas initially, probably sometime around early to mid-afternoon or so. And then that QLCS will move eastward pretty quickly. We'll have to watch for tornadoes, some strong, and damaging winds within that line. And then we will also have to watch for significant tornadoes out ahead of that line in the prefrontal warm sector. Those will have the greatest threat for long track, strong tornadoes, as that will be a more discrete mode favored there. So that's going to do it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.